The letter had been sitting in Levi Rhodes's breast pocket for so long that the paper had softened along the creases like old skin. And on the morning Florence Hawkins traded her last horse to cross Sutton's Pass, she did not yet know that the man on the other side had read her words so many times he had memorized every curve of her handwriting. It was the autumn of 1878 in the Colorado Territory, and the land was doing what it always did in October, turning itself gold and crimson and brutal all at once, as if beauty and hardship were two sides of the same coin, which, in Florence's experience, they almost always were. She stood at the base of the pass in the cold morning light with her mare, Duchess, a chestnut animal of 12 years who had carried her through worse terrain than this, and she looked up at the narrow trail cutting through the rock faces and felt the particular kind of dread that only comes when a person has run completely out of options. Her situation was not complicated to explain, though it was complicated to live. She had set out from Abilene, Kansas, 3 weeks prior, carrying with her everything she owned, a carpetbag with a change of clothes, a small tin of hardtack biscuits, a skinning knife her father had left her, $40 sewn into the hem of her dress, and a name. The name was Levi Rhodes, and it belonged to a man in the town of Claro Springs, Colorado, a man she had never met in person, but to whom she had written a letter in the spring of 1876 through the intermediary of his cousin, Thomas Rhodes, who had worked the cattle yard in Abilene before he died of fever. Thomas had told her about Levi in those easy, rambling conversations that happened between people who worked near each other for long hours. He had said Levi was a good man, that he ran a small ranch on the eastern slope of the Rockies, that he was 31 years old and steady and honest, and that he had been alone since his wife Clara had passed from childbed fever 3 years prior. Thomas had said it without suggesting anything by it, the way people mention things that are simply true, and Florence had filed it away in the back of her mind, the way she filed away many things, quietly, for later. Later had come in the form of a spring evening in 1876 when her own life had contracted to something nearly unlivable. Her mother had died that January. Her employer at the boarding house in Abilene, a man named Garrett, had taken to drinking heavily, and with that drinking had come a particular kind of cruelty toward the women in his employ that Florence had learned to navigate with careful footwork for months, until she could not any more. She had written the letter to Levi Rhodes on a night when she had nothing left but the impulse toward hope, which she had always found to be the most stubborn thing in a human being. She had written it with honesty, because dishonesty had never seemed to her a good foundation for anything. She had told him her name, her age 26 at the time of writing, her situation, her character as best she could describe it, her ability to cook and sew and work hard and think clearly. She had told him that she was not writing in expectation of anything, but only in the belief that two people might sometimes find in each other something worth building, if they were willing. She had given him her address at the boarding house and asked him to write back if he was moved to do so, and if he was not, she wished him well. And then she had waited. She had waited through the spring and into the summer of 1876, and the letter had not come. She had waited through the fall and into the winter, and still nothing. By the time 1877 arrived, she had told herself the answer was in the silence, and she had made her peace with it as best she could, and gotten on with the business of surviving. She had moved from Garrett's boarding house to a position cooking for a ranch family named Aldercott, 20 miles outside of Abilene, and that had been better, honest work, decent people, a small room of her own with a window that looked out over the plains. She had almost stopped thinking about the letter and the unanswered silence when Thomas Rhodes's other cousin, a girl named Mabel who occasionally came through with the supply wagon, had stopped at the Aldercott Ranch in the early spring of 1878 and mentioned, entirely in passing, that the postmaster in Claro Springs had shut down the original post office nearly 2 years ago when the man running it had left without notice. and that a great deal of correspondence from that period had been delayed or misdirected, only recently recovered and rerouted. Florence had stood in the doorway of the ranch kitchen with a pot of coffee in her hand and felt something open up in her chest that she had thought she had sealed shut. She had written a second letter that same evening to the new postmaster's address in Claro Springs, asking if there was a Levi Rhodes in residence and whether her first correspondence might have reached him. She had told him she would be traveling to Colorado in the coming months and that if he was still of an open mind, she hoped they might meet. She had sent the letter, and then she had given her notice at the Aldercott Ranch, packed her carpetbag, saddled Duchess, and started west and south toward the Colorado Territory, because at 28 years old with no family left and no particular reason to stay rooted to any one patch of Kansas soil, the act of moving toward something felt more survivable than the act of standing still. And now here she was, at the foot of Sutton's Pass, with the problem of the horse. The man collecting the pass toll was named Orville Peckett, and he was the sort of man who had made a tolerable living from other people's necessity. He sat on a flat boulder with a rifle across his knees and a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and he looked at Florence and Duchess with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation. $2 for a person crossing on horseback, he said. That's the rate. I have $2, Florence said, though she said it with the careful tone of a woman who was calculating. $2 out of her 40 left her 38, and she had needed those $2 for food on the other side, where the next settlement was still a day's ride east of Claro Springs. What's the rate without the horse? Orville looked at Duchess. $1.50 for a person on foot. But that trail is rough going on foot. 3 miles of switchbacks. You wouldn't make it before dark, and you don't want to be on that pass after dark. Florence looked at Duchess too. The mare was old, it was true. She was a good horse, loyal and patient, but 12 was getting on in years for an animal that had worked as hard as this one, and Florence had known since Kansas that she couldn't take Duchess much further without the mare breaking down under the effort. It was a thought she had been pushing away for weeks because Duchess was the last thing that had belonged to her father, and parting with her felt like swallowing a stone. "What would you give me for her?" Florence asked. Orville set down his coffee cup and stood up and walked around Duchess with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this many times. He checked her teeth and her hooves and ran a hand along her flank and looked at her eyes, and Florence stood very still and let him do it because she had already decided. "She's old," he said. 12, 13, 12. Sound enough. I'll give you passage across plus $1.50 in trade. Florence did the arithmetic in her head. Passage across, which was $2 plus $1.50 cash, meant she was effectively getting $3.50 in value for a horse that was worth considerably more when she had bought her 5 years ago, but was now, honestly, worth what the market said she was worth, which was apparently this. "Passage across for both of us," Florence said. "There and back if I need it, and $2. Orville looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect. "Passage there and back and $1.75. "Done," Florence said. She gave herself exactly as long as it took to remove the saddle and her carpetbag from Duchess's back before she turned away, because if she stood there looking at the horse's wide brown eyes any longer she was going to change her mind, and she did not have the luxury of that. She heard Duchess make a low sound behind her as she started up the trail, and she pressed her lips together and kept walking, because the only direction that mattered now was forward. The trail up Sutton's Pass was everything Orville had described and worse. It was a narrow cut through granite faces that required her to press herself flat against the rock in places where the path narrowed to barely a foot wide, the valley dropping away below her in a way that made her stomach ride up into her chest. The October wind was sharp and mean at this elevation, cutting through her wool coat as though it were cotton, and the sky above her was the pale hard blue of a cold day turning colder. She climbed for 2 hours. Her boots were not made for this kind of work. They were town boots, worn thin at the sole, and she could feel every rock and root through the leather. Her carpetbag pulled at her shoulder and she shifted it from one side to the other every 20 minutes like clockwork. She did not let herself stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant the full weight of what she was doing would settle onto her, and she was not sure she could carry that weight and move at the same time. She thought about the letter instead. She thought about the words she had written, how carefully she had chosen them, how honest they had been. She thought about whether a man who had received such a letter and held it for 2 years was the kind of man she hoped he was, or whether the silence she had taken for a lost postal route had in fact been the silence of a man who had read her words and found them wanting. She reached the summit of the pass in the early afternoon, gasping, her legs burning, and she stood at the crest of the ridge and looked out over the eastern slope of the Rockies and felt something enormous move through her. The land below was a wide amber valley broken by pine stands and a silver thread of river, and in the far distance she could see the smear of dark shapes that meant a settlement. And beyond that, further than her eyes could reach, somewhere in that vast and indifferent landscape, Levi Rhodes was either waiting for her or he was not. She started down. The descent was easier on the lungs but harder on the knees, and she had to pick her way carefully over loose shale in places where the trail crumbled at the edges. It took her another hour and a half to reach the valley floor, and by the time she did, the afternoon light was beginning its slow tilt toward evening gold, and her feet were aching in a way that she suspected meant blisters, and her stomach was reminding her with considerable conviction that hardtack biscuits and determination were not, in the end, a complete nutritional plan. She found the road, a proper road, rutted but wide enough for a wagon, about a quarter mile from the bottom of the pass, and she followed it east toward the shapes of buildings she had seen from the summit. The town she came to first was not Claro Springs. It was a smaller place called Renner's Ford, a scatter of maybe a dozen structures centered on a general store and a livery, and she went to the general store because she needed food and information in approximately equal measure. The woman behind the counter at Renner's Ford General Store was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pinned back under a cotton cap, and she looked at Florence with the comprehensive, instinctive assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize another woman in some kind of complicated trouble. "You came over the pass on foot," she said, looking at Florence's boots and her carpetbag and the general state of her. "I did," Florence said. "Sit down before you fall down," the woman said, and brought a stool out from behind the counter without waiting to be asked. Her name was Edna Calloway, and she fed Florence a bowl of beans and cornbread and a cup of strong tea, and while Florence ate, they talked. Florence learned that Claro Springs was about 12 miles further east on this same road, that the road was good all the way and well-traveled enough that she would likely find a wagon or rider going that direction if she waited until morning, and that Levi Rhodes was in fact a person known to Edna Calloway, though not well. "He comes through here twice a year or so for supplies," Edna said, measuring coffee beans into a sack with practiced efficiency. "Quiet man, keeps to himself, but he's never been rude about it, which I appreciate. Lost his wife a while back." "Yes," Florence said, "I heard that." Edna looked at her with that comprehensive gaze again. "You know him?" "I hope to," Florence said, which was both truthful and incomplete. Edna gave her a room for the night in the small space above the store where she kept lodgers, charging her 50 cents, which Florence paid without complaint. She lay on the narrow cot with its thin mattress and looked at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow, about what she would say when she arrived in Claro Springs and began asking after Levi Rhodes. She tried to imagine his face and found she couldn't, which was strange and made her slightly dizzy, as if she had spent 2 years with her heart angled toward a direction she could not see. She slept eventually, and dreamed of nothing she could remember, and woke before dawn to a cold room and the sound of wind against the window glass. Edna had coffee ready when Florence came downstairs, and by the time the light was fully up, there was a farm wagon heading east toward Claro Springs driven by a man named Henderson, who was happy enough to have company on the road and charged her nothing for the ride, saying only that she could help him unload sacks of grain when they reached the feed store at the other end. Florence rode on the wagon bench beside Henderson, who was a talker, which suited her because it meant she could listen and nod and not have to generate much of her own conversation, and the 12 miles rolled by under the wagon wheels in a state of suspension that felt like the held breath before something inevitable. Claro Springs appeared around a bend in the road where the valley narrowed, and the pine trees pressed in close on both sides and then opened suddenly onto a wide flat area of good ground. And there it was a proper town, larger than she had expected. It had a main street of considerable length, lined with false-fronted buildings that ran to 2 stories in several places. There was a hotel, a bank, 2 saloons, a hardware store, a land office, a doctor's shingle hanging above a white-painted door, a church at the far end of the street with a modest steeple, and what appeared to be a livery stable of decent size. People moved along the wooden boardwalks with the purposeful, unhurried pace of people who know where they are going, and the whole scene had the particular quality of a place that had survived its roughest years and was settling into something more like permanence. Florence helped Henderson unload his grain sacks, which took 40 minutes and left her arms tired in a good clean way, and then she picked up her carpetbag and walked to the center of Main Street and looked around with the careful attention of a woman orienting herself. And then she walked to the post office, because the post office was where everything had started. The postmaster was a young man named Callum Briggs, no more than 22 or 23, with ink-stained fingers and an organized manner that suggested he was good at his job and knew it. He looked up from his sorting when Florence came in. "I'm looking for a man named Levi Rhodes," Florence said. "I wrote to him earlier this year, and I'm hoping he received the letter. My name is Florence Hawkins." Callum Briggs looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read, and then he reached under the counter and produced a sealed envelope, and Florence felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "This came back to us," he said. "We couldn't deliver it. Rhodes's ranch is about 8 miles out, and the rider we sent out twice came back both times saying there was no one home. It's been waiting here for going on 3 months. He set the envelope on the counter between them. It was not her second letter. It was addressed in a hand she did not recognize, and the name on it was Florence Hawkins, care of the Claro Springs Post Office, Colorado Territory. Her hands were very steady when she picked it up, which surprised her, because inside she was anything but. "Thank you," she said, and took the letter to the wooden bench along the wall of the post office and sat down and opened it. The paper inside was good quality, a thick cream color, and the handwriting was small and even, slanting slightly to the right in a way that suggested someone who had been taught to write with care and had kept the habit. She read it. He had written, "Miss Hawkins, I have been in possession of your first letter since the spring of 1876, when it reached me by a roundabout route via a cousin of Thomas's in Denver, who had received it misdirected. I cannot explain what it meant to me on the evening I read it, except to say that I read it many times. I have not written back until now because I am not a man who writes letters quickly or easily, and I wanted to write you a true one rather than a fast one. By the time I had composed what I wanted to say, I understood from Mabel Rhodes that you had already sent a second letter indicating your intention to travel here, and so I am writing now not to introduce myself, but to say that I will be here, and that I would very much like to meet the woman who wrote me that first letter. I have been holding it for 2 years. It has not grown less remarkable to me. Yours respectfully, Levi Rhodes." Florence read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her carpetbag alongside everything else she owned, which was not very much, but which now included this, and she thought that sometimes the things that matter most take up very little physical space. "Do you know how to get to the Rhodes Ranch?" she asked Callum Briggs. 8 miles east on the main road, then north on a track marked with a cut pine post," he said. It's a half-day's walk, or you might find someone heading that direction." Florence nodded. She was not afraid of walking. She had just crossed an entire mountain pass on foot, and the letter in her bag had given her legs a new kind of energy. She did not find anyone heading that direction, as it turned out, but the road was good, and the day was clear and cold and beautiful, and she walked the 8 miles in a state of focused calm that she recognized as the particular feeling of a person moving towards something that has already been decided in some deeper part of them, long before the mind caught up. The track north from the cut pine post was a 2-rut wagon path through tall grass gone brown with autumn, and it ran alongside a fence line of good straight posts that told her the man who built it took his work seriously. After about a mile, the track curved around a stand of aspen trees, their leaves still holding a few last coins of gold, and the ranch came into view. It was a modest operation, but a careful one. The house was log-built, 1 story, with a covered porch running the full front length, and it sat well on the land, as though it had been placed there by someone who understood how a building should relate to the country around it. There was a barn of decent size behind it, painted red the way barns should be, and a pole corral containing 3 horses, and a kitchen garden to one side of the house that had been harvested and put to bed for winter with the tidy precision of someone who expected to be using it again come spring. There was a man in the corral. He was working with one of the horses, a gray, running a hand along the animal's neck with the patient, repetitive motion of someone who has done this 1,000 times and finds it satisfying every time. He was tall, she could see that even from this distance, with broad shoulders and dark hair under a battered hat, and he was wearing a canvas work coat and worn leather gloves and boots that had seen considerable use. He had not heard her yet. She stood at the corral fence for a moment, watching him work, and she felt something settle into place in her chest with the quiet inevitability of a key turning in a lock it was made for. Then he turned and saw her. He went very still for a moment, the way animals go still when they become aware of something new in their environment. Not frightened, just present, all attention brought to a single point. She saw him register her, saw his eyes move from her face to her carpetbag to the road behind her and back to her face, and she saw the moment when he understood who she was. He came to the fence. He was 33 now. She calculated, she was 28, and the 5-year difference felt entirely manageable, and up close he was exactly the sort of man his letter suggested he would be. His face was weathered in the honest way of men who work outdoors, with lines at the corners of eyes that had spent a lot of time looking at distances. His eyes were a very dark brown, almost black in the shadow of his hat brim, and they were looking at her with an intensity that was not rude but was entirely direct, the kind of looking that only happens when a person is seeing something they have thought about for a long time and finds that reality and imagination have been negotiating without them. "Florence Hawkins," he said. "Levi Rhodes," she said. They stood on opposite sides of the corral fence looking at each other, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was full, the way silences are full when there has been too much to say for too long and the 2 people involved have simultaneously arrived at the point where speaking must begin. "You walked from town," he said. It was not a question. He could see the state of her boots, the way she was standing, the tiredness in her that was not defeat but simple exhaustion. "I walked from town," she said. "I walked over the pass yesterday too, for that matter." Something shifted in his expression. "Over the pass, on foot. I traded my horse for the crossing," she said. She was old, and it seemed the most practical arrangement. He pushed his hat back on his head in a gesture that seemed less like a deliberate action and more like an involuntary response to the information he had just received. "You traded your horse to cross the pass." She was 12 years old. She wouldn't have made it much further anyway. Florence said it evenly because she had made peace with it on the trail, even if making peace with something did not mean it didn't still ache. He opened the corral gate and came through it, and closed it behind him in one easy, continuous motion, and stopped about 2 feet away from her. This close, he was even more solidly present than he had seemed from a distance, and she could see that his hands, when he pulled off the right glove and held it out, were work-roughened and strong, and she shook his hand the way she would shake anyone's hand, because she was that kind of woman and felt his grip close around hers, warm and certain. "I got your first letter the wrong way and late," he said. "I'm sorry for that." "I got your response 3 months late, and today," she said. "We seem to be even." That made something happen to his mouth that was almost a smile, but restrained itself at the last moment, as though he was not quite ready to give that much away yet. "Come inside," he said. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in a while." "I had beans in Renner's Ford," she said. "That's not a proper meal," he said, and picked up her carpetbag before she could protest, and led her toward the house. The inside of the house told her things about him that the outside had suggested. It was clean, which she had not necessarily expected from a man living alone, and it was organized in the way of someone who knows where everything is and puts things back when he is done with them. The main room served as both sitting room and dining room, with a fireplace on the south wall and a table of good solid construction in the center and 2 chairs and a wooden settle along one wall. There were books. She noticed those immediately, a small shelf of them by the fireplace, which she found interesting. There was a braided rug on the plank floor and curtains at the windows that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing with fabric and were not, she suspected, Levi Rhodes's work. "Clara made those," he said, seeing where she was looking, and his voice was even when he said it, the way voices are even when grief has been lived with long enough to become something quieter. She was handy with a needle. "They're lovely," Florence said simply, and meant it, and did not elaborate, because sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for a man's loss is to acknowledge it without ceremony and move on. He made coffee and scrambled eggs, and fried a piece of salt pork and cut bread from a loaf that was 2 days old but still good, and set it all on the table with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man feeding someone who needed feeding. And Florence sat down and ate with the wholehearted gratitude of someone who had been running on determination and hardtack for 3 days. They talked while she ate. Not about the letters, not yet. That felt like a conversation that needed to be approached from the side rather than head-on, but about practical things, which was how both of them seemed to prefer to begin. He asked her about the journey, and she told him about it without dramatizing it. The way she had moved from Abilene across Kansas and into the territory, the roads she had taken, the weather she had run into, the crossing of the pass. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested in what is being said, without fidgeting or looking away, and she found this quality immediately pleasant and notable. She asked about the ranch, and he told her about it. 160 acres under a homestead claim, running a small cattle herd of 30 head plus the horses, with hay fields that he cut and put up himself in summer, and a kitchen garden that had become more productive each year. He had a neighbor family, the Garcias, about 3 miles east, who he traded work with during the busy seasons, and a hired hand named Petey Stroud who came on for roundup and branding, but was otherwise occupied with the Garcia operation. "It's a one-man ranch," he said, not with apology but with the clarity of someone who knows what he has and knows its honest value. "I'm good with cattle," Florence said. "And I can grow things, and I'm a fair hand with accounts if you keep them, which a ranch should." He looked at her across the table. "You're telling me what you bring," he said. "I'm telling you what I bring," she agreed. "I told you most of it in the letter, but 2 years is a long time, and I thought it was worth saying plainly." "I remember what you said in the letter," he said, and the way he said it was not casual, it was deliberate, with a weight to it that told her he was not just saying it as a matter of politeness, but as a statement of actual fact. He did remember. She thought about what he had written, that he had read it many times, that it had not grown less remarkable to him, and felt the warmth of that settle into her bones alongside the warmth of the coffee. "I read your letter in the post office before I came out here," she said. "I wanted you to know that." He nodded slowly. I wrote it 5 or 6 times before I got it right. It was right, she said, another of those almost smiles. She was beginning to think the almost smile was his default expression, the outward sign of something he was still deciding whether to fully commit to, and she found it endearing in a way that surprised her. He showed her the small spare room that evening. It had been a room for storage, he said, but he had cleared it out and put a proper bed in it when he received word from Levi Rhodes that Florence was on her way, and she thought about the fact that he had cleared a room and made a bed for her, and what that meant about his intentions, which seemed to align with hers in a way she was trying not to get ahead of herself about. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, "until we've had more time to talk and you know your own mind about things." "I know my own mind," Florence said. "I've had 2 years to develop an opinion." "So have I," he said, "but I think we both deserve a little more than 2 letters and 1 afternoon." He said it gently, without judgment or implication, and she realized she appreciated the care of it, the way he was not rushing toward the thing both of them could feel in the room, but was instead treating it with the respect that a thing of consequence deserves. "Fair enough," she said. She slept that night in a real bed with a quilt that was warm and heavy and smelled of cedar from the chest it had been stored in. And outside the window there were more stars than she had seen in years, because out here there was nothing between her and the sky. And she lay looking at them for a long time before she slept, thinking about how the distance between two people is not always about miles. The next 2 weeks had a particular quality to them that Florence would think about for the rest of her life, as one of the most unexpectedly fine periods she had ever lived through. She stayed, and he stayed in the barn without complaint and without awkwardness about it, and they worked the ranch together in the way that people reveal themselves most truly through small daily labors done alongside each other. She was good with the cattle, as she had said she was, and he watched her move among them in the corral with a calm authority that the animals responded to, and she could see from the corner of her eye that he was watching and finding what he saw satisfying. She repaired the kitchen garden fence that had partly come down in a fall storm, using a post driver and wire with the competent efficiency of someone who had fixed fences before, and when he came around the corner of the house and saw her at it, he stopped and leaned against the barn wall and watched for a moment without saying anything, and she said, without looking up from the wire, "I said I was good with cattle. I didn't say I couldn't do other things." "I see that," he said. She found the account ledger on the kitchen shelf and spent an evening going through it, because she had offered to and because she was genuinely curious about the financial state of the operation she was considering attaching herself to. He sat across the table from her while she worked, reading one of his books, and she noticed that he was comfortable with silence in the same way she was comfortable with silence, which is to say they both found it a kind of companionship rather than an absence. "Your hay income in '77 was nearly $30 more than '76, she said, not looking up from the ledger. "Good growing season," he said, not looking up from his book. "Your feed costs went up the same year, though, so you net about $8 a head, not 30. He did look up then. "I hadn't broken it down that way. "I like numbers," she said. "They always tell you something true." He studied her for a moment with those dark eyes that she was learning to read. He was not, she had discovered, an effusive man. He did not say things easily or often, but when he said them, they were worth hearing. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "The letter was remarkable. I think I expected you to be remarkable and I was right, but the form it takes is different from what I imagined." "Is the difference bad?" "No," he said, quietly and with complete certainty. "No, the difference is better." She looked back at the ledger because she needed to look at something other than his face for a moment, and he looked back at his book, and the fire in the fireplace did what fires do in October evenings in Colorado territory, and the world outside was cold and dark and enormous, and inside the small log house it was warm. There were conversations, too, in those 2 weeks, real ones, the kind that happen when people are honest with each other and have time and enough quiet around them to say what they mean. She told him about her life before her father, who had been a farmer in Missouri and a good man who died too young. Her mother, who had been capable and fierce and whose death had left Florence genuinely unmoored for months. The years in Abilene, Garrett's boarding house and the unpleasantness of it, the cattle yard where Thomas Rhodes had worked. She told it plainly, without asking for sympathy, just giving him the facts of her because she believed he deserved them. He told her about his. He had grown up in Illinois, the son of a blacksmith, had come west at 22 with the optimism of a young man who had read too many accounts of free land and wide skies, and had found, to his genuine surprise, that the accounts were not wholly inaccurate. He had built the ranch over 5 years, had met Clara through a church meeting in a settlement 30 miles south, had married her, and had 1 year of what he described as the kind of happiness a person doesn't fully understand the value of while they are in it. He talked about her death with the directness of a man who has grieved cleanly and completely, who has honored the loss without being imprisoned by it, and Florence respected that more than she could easily say. "I'm not trying to replace her," Florence said one evening because it needed to be said. "I know that," he said, "and I'm not trying to fill a specific shape. I'm trying to see what this is if you're willing to do the same." "I've been willing since 1876, she said. That was the first time she saw the full smile, not the almost, but the real one, and it transformed his face in a way that made her breath catch, because it was the smile of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. On the 15th day, he asked her to walk with him to the north pasture in the late afternoon to check on the cattle before dark. It was a cool evening, the sky going amber and rose above the mountain line to the west, and they walked side by side on the worn grass path, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched at the uneven places in the ground. At the fence line he stopped and looked out at the cattle and was quiet for a while in the way he was quiet, which was with thought behind it rather than emptiness, and Florence waited. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "permanently, as my wife if you're willing. I want to say it plainly because I think you're the kind of person who prefers things said plainly, and I think I should ask you properly rather than letting it be assumed." Florence looked at the mountains. The last light was catching on the snow at the high peaks and turning them pink, and below the snow the dark green of the pines went on, and below that the amber valley, and below that this fence and this man and this question. "I wrote you a letter 3 years ago," she said, "because I thought you sounded like someone worth knowing. Then I waited a year for you to write back, and when you didn't, I told myself I had been wrong about what I was feeling. Then I found out your post office had failed, and I wrote you again, and then I traded my horse and crossed a mountain on foot to get here, so I think it should be fairly clear what my answer is." He turned from the fence to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the light was doing something lovely to everything around them, and he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a careful gentleness that was the first truly intimate thing he had done, and she leaned into it slightly, involuntarily, the way a person leans toward warmth. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to take you to meet Reverend Holt in Claro Springs and do it properly." "That's what I want too," she said. He kissed her then, briefly and carefully, in the evening light beside the north pasture fence, with the cattle moving in the background and the mountains going pink and dark. And it was not a dramatic kiss, not a desperate one, but rather the kind of kiss that feels like a contract between two people who have been moving toward each other for a long time and have finally arrived. They rode into Claro Springs 3 days later to see Reverend Holt, because by then Levi had saddled the gray horse from the corral and put Florence up on a gentle bay mare named Rosie, who turned out to be considerably more responsive than Duchess had been in her later years. And Florence thought with a small, quiet pang about Duchess on the other side of the pass with Orville Peckett, and hoped the old mare was being treated well. Reverend Holt was a spare, tall man of perhaps 60, with a Virginia accent that had survived decades in Colorado entirely intact, and he met them in his study and asked the relevant questions with the directness of a man who had performed many marriages and developed a reliable sense of which ones were going to hold. He asked them each separately and together about their intentions and their circumstances, and when he was done, he said, "I'll be glad to perform the ceremony." "What date suits you?" 2 weeks, Levi said and looked at Florence, who nodded. 2 weeks, Holt said and wrote it in his register. They were married on a Saturday morning in early November 1878, in the Claro Springs church with its modest steeple, on a day that was cold and clear with a first light skiff of snow on the peaks above. The witnesses were the Garcia family, Miguel and Rosa Garcia, and their 3 children, who had brought flowers from Rosa's dried arrangement because there was nothing fresh in November, and Callum Briggs from the post office, who had taken a personal interest in the matter since the day Florence had come in looking for Levi's letter, and Edna Calloway from Renner's Ford, who had driven 12 miles in the cold because she said she had known, when she saw Florence walking in off the pass, that the story was going to be worth following to its conclusion. Florence wore her second-best dress, which was also her best dress, the blue one that had traveled with her from Abilene in the carpetbag, and Rosa Garcia had lent her a white shawl that was prettier than anything Florence owned. Levi wore his good coat and a clean shirt and his hat in his hands, and he looked at Florence when she came down the aisle between the wooden pews with an expression on his face that was so openly and completely without reserve that she felt it like warmth from a fire from across a room. Reverend Holt's words were simple and meant, and when he asked the questions that required answers, Levi said yes to his with the quiet certainty of a man who has thought a thing through entirely, and Florence said yes to hers with the clarity of a woman who has walked a very long way to arrive at this particular yes, and has no doubt in it whatsoever. After the ceremony, the Garcias produced a covered basket containing bread and dried fruit, and a small cake that Rosa had made the night before, and they all ate together in the church hall with the wood stove going, and the snow beginning to fall outside the windows in the serious way it falls in November in Colorado when it means business, and Florence sat beside her husband, which was a word she turned over in her mind with something like wonder, and felt for the first time in a very long time the particular peace of having arrived somewhere you are supposed to be. Miguel Garcia, who was a man of 40 with a broad, warm face and the hands of someone who had worked hard and was proud of it, raised a cup of coffee and said, "To Levi and Florence Rhodes, may the ranch prosper and the winters be short." "May the winters be short," everyone agreed and drank, and the snow fell outside, and the wood stove crackled, and Florence looked at Levi and found him already looking at her, and they shared a look that contained everything they had not yet said to each other and were looking forward to saying, in the long, slow time that lay ahead of them. The first winter was hard in the way that first winters in new lives are hard, not cruel, but demanding, insisting on the reality of the commitment rather than the romance of it. The snow came deep that year, as deep as the old-timers in Claro Springs said it had not come in 5 years, and Levi and Florence spent days digging out the cattle from drifts and hauling hay from the barn and keeping the pipes from freezing. They worked together in the mornings in a kind of wordless teamwork that develops between 2 people when they are genuinely matched in competence and respect for each other's abilities, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and she read aloud from his book sometimes, and he mended tack or worked on accounts, and those evenings were some of the best of Florence's life. There were harder evenings, too. There was a night in January when a calf was born in the cold and died within the hour despite everything they did, and Florence found Levi standing at the barn door afterward looking out at the dark snow-covered world with an expression that she had come to recognize as the face of a man who feels losses quietly and deeply. And she stood beside him and put her hand through his arm and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Just let the warmth of being present do what it could. And after a while he put his hand over hers, and they stood that way for a long time. There was also the matter of the letter. She had shown him her copy of his letter, the one Callum Briggs had been holding, the week after they were married, wanting him to know she had read it before she came to him. He had looked at it in his hands for a moment with a curious expression. "I want to show you something," he said, and went to his coat on the peg by the door and reached into the breast pocket and produced a folded piece of paper that was soft along the creases from much handling, and brought it to her. It was her first letter. The one she had written in the spring of 1876, that she had almost given up hope of. The one she had thought was lost for a year before she learned about the post office failure. The paper was worn and soft, and she could see where it had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were almost transparent with use, and she held it and looked at him. "You kept it in your coat pocket," she said. "Since the day I got it," he said. "I know that might sound strange." "It doesn't sound strange," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, because it did not sound strange at all. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing you do when you receive a letter from someone, and it reaches some part of you that you had not realized was waiting to be reached, and you carry it with you because having it close feels like having something important close. "I wrote you back 6 times," he said. "I just never sent it. I kept starting and throwing it away because it didn't seem right. Then by the time I got it right, I heard you were already coming." "What did you want to say?" she asked. He looked at her across the small table in the firelight. "I wanted to say that I read your letter on a night when I had been alone for 3 years and had started to believe that was the shape my life was going to have permanently, and that what you wrote made me feel like something was possible that I had stopped thinking was possible." He paused. "That's not very eloquent." "That's the most eloquent thing I've ever heard," Florence said, and meant every syllable of it. He smiled, the full smile, the real one, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the fire crackled and the wind moved around the outside of the house, and Florence felt the kind of happiness that is not exciting but is instead profound, the kind that settles in the marrow and stays. Spring came as it always does, eventually and with authority, and the ranch came alive in ways that delighted Florence in proportion to how much she had spent the winter anticipating them. She put the kitchen garden in properly, expanding it by 1/3 from what Levi had been running, adding rows of beans and squash and a patch of flowers, not because flowers were practical, but because she had been living practically for a very long time and had earned flowers. The cattle calved out well, and she was there for most of the births, developing a working partnership with the animals that Levi watched with quiet admiration. "Where did you learn cattle?" he asked her one morning in April, leaning on the fence watching her work. "Aldercott Ranch," she said. "Outside Abilene, 2 years. Mr. Aldercott was a patient teacher." "He did a good job," Levi said. "He had a good student," Florence said, which made him laugh outright, and she stored the sound of that away because Levi Rhodes' laughing was a good sound, generous and warm, and entirely without self-consciousness. The Garcia family became the center of their social world in a way that felt entirely natural. Miguel and Levi had the easy friendship of men who had worked alongside each other for years and known each other's reliability through that knowing. And Rosa Garcia took to Florence with an immediacy and warmth that Florence found both touching and slightly overwhelming at first, having not had close female company in some years. Rosa was 35, a strong and opinionated woman from a family that had been in Colorado territory for 2 generations, long before it was American territory at all, and she had opinions about most things and expressed them freely, which Florence appreciated because it meant she never had to wonder what Rosa was actually thinking. "He is a very solitary man, Levi," Rosa said one afternoon in May when they were working together in Florence's garden, Rosa having come over with her oldest daughter to help transplant seedlings. "Before you came, I worried about him. A person cannot live only by work." "He's not solitary with me," Florence said. Rosa looked at her with her dark eyes and smiled. "No," she said, "I can see that. You are good for each other. You have the same way of being in a room, very still but very present. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Florence said, and she did. In June, a complication arrived in the form of a man from Levi's past. His name was Darcy Mullen, and he appeared one morning at the ranch gate on a lathered horse, a heavy-set man of 40 with a red face and the air of someone who has been traveling fast and does not have good news. He had worked with Levi years back on a cattle drive out of Texas, and he arrived with a debt, not money owed to Levi, but a trouble he had brought with him, the kind that follows certain men and tends to spread when it arrives. Mullen had been running from a group of men he had cheated in a land deal in New Mexico, and he had ridden to Levi's ranch because it was the most remote place he knew, and he thought he could shelter there while things quieted down. Florence was the one who opened the door to him, Levi being out in the far pasture, and she sized him up in approximately 30 seconds with the accuracy that comes from having dealt with a great many difficult men in her life. She offered him water and a seat on the porch, because a person in need of water gets water, but she did not offer him more than that until Levi came back. Levi's reception of Mullen was not unfriendly but was measured. He listened to the story with the patient attention he gave everything, and then he said, "I can give you one night and a fresh horse to get you further along, but I won't take on your trouble here, Darcy. I have a wife now and a ranch to protect, and I won't put either of them in the path of something they have no part in." Mullen looked at Florence with a calculating expression, and Florence looked back at him without shifting a degree. "One night is more than I've had in a week," Mullen said finally. "I'll take it." He left before dawn the next morning on a good horse, heading north toward Wyoming, and Levi came back inside from seeing him off and found Florence already up and making coffee, and he sat down at the table and looked at her. "I should have consulted you before I offered him the horse," he said. "You offered him the horse to get him moving along," Florence said. "Which was the right decision. I would have said the same." "Still," he said. "Levi," she said, and waited until he looked at her. "We think alike in most ways that matter. I trust your judgment. You can trust mine. That's what this is." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and said, "Yes, that's what this is." The men who had been following Mullen did appear on the road past the ranch 2 days later, 3 of them, hard-looking, well-armed, moving north, but they did not stop, and Levi and Florence watched them from the porch without comment, and they passed by and did not come back, and that particular trouble resolved itself by going away, which is not the most dramatic resolution but is often the most welcome kind. By the fall of 1879, the ranch was doing demonstrably better than it had been doing before Florence arrived, which was something she noted in the accounts with quiet satisfaction, and Levi noted in the broader condition of the whole operation the improved garden harvest, the better cattle management, the careful attention to the things that needed attention before they became problems. He told her this directly, which was his way, and she received it directly, which was hers. "The ranch is doing well," he said one evening in October, looking at the ledger she had laid open on the table. "We're doing well," she said. "Together, that's the difference." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and there was something in his expression that was very full and very certain. "I know," he said. "I know exactly what made the difference." In November of 1879, Florence discovered she was going to have a baby. She knew before she said anything to Levi, carrying the knowledge around with her for about a week in the particular internal silence of a woman who is processing something of great magnitude. She thought about the fact that this was what had ended Clara's life, childbed fever, and she thought about it with care and honesty, and without denying herself the fact of the fear, because Florence had always found that the only way to live with fear was to look at it directly. When she told Levi, they were at the table after supper, the evening routine that had become the rhythm of their life together, and she set down her coffee cup and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the tack he was mending, read her face, and set the leather down carefully. She told him simply, and watched his face move through something complex and layered joy, which was immediate and unmistakable, and which lit his whole face in a way she had not seen before. And underneath that, something else, something careful and wary that she recognized as the mark that Clara's death had left on him. "I'm healthy and strong," she said, because she knew what he was thinking. "I've worked hard my whole life. I'm not Clara." "No," he said, and his voice was rough with something restrained. "You're not, and I'm grateful for that every day." He came around the table and pulled her to him and held her in a way that was new, not the gentle considering quality of their early embraces, but something more urgent, like a man making sure something real is real. And she held him back and put her face against his shoulder and let the warmth of him be what it was. "I want us to go to Claro Springs and speak to the doctor," she said into his coat, "so that everything is done properly and with the best information available." "Tomorrow," he said without hesitation. Dr. Walsh in Claro Springs was a practical, competent man of 50 who had been practicing medicine in the Colorado Territory for 15 years and had attended more births than he could count. He examined Florence with professional care and told her she was in good health, that the baby appeared to be progressing normally, and that he saw no reason why things should not go well. He spoke to Levi with the directness the man clearly needed, acknowledging the fear behind the question Levi asked without making it something to be ashamed of, and Florence stood by and was grateful for the doctor's steady, plain manner. The pregnancy unfolded through the winter of 1879 and into the spring of 1880, and Levi's care of Florence during this period was one of the things she would love him most fiercely for in the years that followed. He was not overbearing or nervous in ways that would have been suffocating. He was attentive, practical, and present. He took on more of the heavy physical work without drawing attention to the redistribution, simply doing what needed to be done. He brought her tea in the evenings without being asked. He read to her sometimes, reversing the earlier habit, his low voice moving through the pages of a Mark Twain novel while she sat by the fire with her feet up, and she would close her eyes and listen to the combination of his voice and the fire, and find it more peaceful than anything she had ever known. Their son was born in June of 1880, on a fine warm morning with the windows open to let in the summer air, with Dr. Walsh in attendance and Rosa Garcia there as well, because Florence had wanted Rosa's calm, competent presence, and Rosa had brought it without ceremony or fuss. The labor was hard and long, but it was not complicated, and when the baby arrived, red-faced and loud and furiously present, Florence lay back against the pillow and heard him cry, and felt the particular exhausted, overwhelming completeness of a woman who has just done one of the most enormous things a person can do. Levi came in when they called him, and he stood at the bedside and looked at his son in Florence's arms with an expression so unguarded that Rosa, watching from across the room, had to turn away and busy herself with something to allow the moment its full privacy. He looked at Florence then, and his eyes were bright with something he was not trying to control, and she looked back at him and thought, This is it. This is what everything was for. "Hello," she said softly, which was addressed to both of them. He reached out and touched the baby's face with one careful finger, and the baby turned toward it in the instinctive searching way of new babies. And Levi made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but something in between. Something that had no common name, because it was the specific sound of a man who thought he had known the extent of what life could give him, and has just been proven entirely wrong. They named him Thomas, for Thomas Rhodes, who had set all of this in motion with his easy rambling conversations in a Kansas cattle yard, and had died of fever before he could see what came of them. Thomas Rhodes grew up fast in the way of ranch children, physically capable and deeply curious, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's decisive manner, and the combination produced a child who was both thoughtful and action-oriented in ways that kept his parents perpetually engaged. He was good with animals from the time he could walk, which everyone who saw it attributed to having been born and raised among them, and he had a particular attachment to Rosie the bay mare, who was patient enough for a child and seemed to actively enjoy his company. When Thomas was 2, Florence began to suspect another child was coming, and this time the confirmation was less fraught with the complicated undertow of fear, because she had done it once and come through it whole, and because Levi, while never ceasing to take it seriously, was able to be more fully present to the joy of it now that the worst fear had been disproven. The second child was a girl born in the late fall of 1882, named Clara, not as a monument to the past, but as a simple acknowledgement that the name was a good name and deserved to continue in the world. Levi had suggested it quietly one evening, framing it as a question, and Florence had considered it with the full respect it deserved and said yes, because she was not afraid of the past, and she was not competing with it. And naming a daughter Clara was a way of saying that love does not have to be exclusive to be complete. Clara was born as differently from her brother as 2 children can be born. Where Thomas was methodical, she was impulsive. Where he was quiet, she was loud. Where he had his father's eyes, she had Florence's green ones and a temper that she had also, by all appearances, inherited from Florence's side of the family. She was, from the first days of her life, spectacular in the way of people who take up exactly as much space as they need and not a square inch less. The years moved with the particular quality of full years, which is to say they were sometimes hard and always real and frequently beautiful in the close-up, unremarkable way that real life is beautiful, not in dramatic vistas and grand gestures, though there were those too, but in the accumulated specific texture of daily existence. The ranch grew steadily under the combined management of 2 people who were both competent and complementary, adding 20 head of cattle by 1883 and a second hired hand who came on full-time, a young man named Abel Torres who had come up from New Mexico looking for honest work and proved to be one of the best decisions the operation had ever made. Florence kept the accounts with the precision that had always been her nature, and the numbers told a consistent and gratifying story of modest growth and sound management, which was more than most operations in the territory could say. There had been a drought year in 1881 that had cut into the hay and required buying feed at expensive prices, and Florence had navigated the family through it with a cool pragmatism that meant selling 3 of the horses they could spare and taking in laundry from 2 families in town through the winter months, because pride was fine when you could afford it, and practical realism was finer when you couldn't. Levi had watched her do this without objection and without ego, and had told her afterwards simply that he did not know what he would have done without her judgment that year. And she had said equally simply that he would have managed because he was not a man who didn't manage, and they had both known it was true, and that she had made it better, and that was enough. Edna Calloway had become a genuine fixture in their lives, the way certain people become fixtures, by being consistently and entirely themselves in ways that make them indispensable. She came to Claro Springs once a month for supplies and always made the additional 12 miles to the Rhodes ranch, arriving at the kitchen door with a covered basket of something she had baked and a quantity of news and opinion that could sustain a 3-hour visit, which she generally made. She had been present at Thomas's birth and Clara's, and she had opinions about both children's characters that she shared freely and with total accuracy. And Florence loved her in the way you love someone who has no ulterior motive and an entirely clear eye. On the evening of Thomas's 5th birthday, there was a supper at the ranch that included the Garcias and Edna and Callum Briggs Callum, who had outgrown the post office and was now a deputy in the county sheriff's office, a transformation that suited him. And after the children were in bed, the adults sat around the table with coffee and the last of a bottle of whiskey that Miguel had brought, and talked in the comfortable way of people who have known each other long enough to say what they mean without preliminary. "You remember when she walked in asking for Levi Rhodes?" Callum said at one point, nodding at Florence, and there was laughter around the table because the story had become, in the telling and retelling over the years, a kind of local legend, the woman who came over the pass on foot. "I remember when she came in off that road," Edna said. "I said to myself, that woman is going somewhere specific and nothing is going to stop her." "Nothing did," Levi said, and looked at Florence with the smile that was no longer the almost but had been the real, full thing for years now, the smile that had become one of the constants of her life alongside the mountains and the sound of the river in spring. "I traded a good horse for the crossing," Florence said. "I was committed. Best trade ever made on this side of the Rockies," Rosa said firmly, which caused the table to laugh again, and Florence felt the warmth of the room and the company and the man beside her and the sleeping children in the next room, and she thought about the woman who had written a letter in 1876 on a desperate night with nothing left but the impulse toward hope, and she thought about what that woman had known and not known, and she thought, she knew enough. She knew enough to write the letter, and that turned out to be sufficient. The ranch turned 15 years old in the fall of 1893, which meant Levi had been working it for 15 years, and Florence had been there for the last 10 of them, which was more than 2/3 of its history, a fact she found satisfying in the way that all proportions satisfy when they tip toward the right side. Thomas was 13 now, already nearly as tall as his father and considerably more willing to talk about his feelings, which Florence attributed to her influence and Levi attributed to the same thing, with the affectionate resignation of a man who finds his wife's influence on his son entirely agreeable. Even when it produces conversations, he is not entirely sure how to navigate. Clara was 11 and had recently decided that she was going to be a doctor, an announcement she made at the supper table with the calm finality of someone informing the rest of the household of a decision that was not up for debate. Levi had looked across the table at Florence, and Florence had looked back at him, and they had looked at Clara together with the synchronized regard of two people who have been married long enough to think in concert. "There are women doctors," Florence said. "Yes, there are," Clara confirmed. "Dr. Mary Walker is one. I read about her." "That's right," Florence said. "It would take a great deal of studying." "I like studying," Clara said, which was true. "Then study," Levi said. And that was that, and Florence stored the moment in the collection of moments she kept in the deep part of herself, the moments that told her things about who they were as a family and who the people around her were becoming. She found Levi on the porch that evening after the children were in bed, sitting in the chair he always sat in when he needed to think, looking out at the dark land, and the sky full of stars that never diminished out here because there was still nothing between them and the sky. She sat beside him in her chair. They had long since added a second chair to the porch because it turned out that two people who both liked to sit on the porch in the evening needed two chairs, and they sat in the companionable silence that had become, over all these years, one of the most intimate things she knew. "Clara's going to do it," she said. "I know she is," he said. "Are you bothered by it?" He considered this with the genuine deliberation he gave to real questions. "No," he said. "I think it's fine. I think she'll be remarkable." "She's your daughter," Florence said. He looked at her sideways with a look she knew well. "She's ours," he said. Florence reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, the same gesture reversed from that first winter when she had gone to him at the barn door and stood beside him in the cold. The gesture had become a language between them over the years, entire conversations compressed into its simple weight. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the letter," she said. "The first one. I think about it sometimes." "So do I," he said. "What do you think about?" He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet she had always loved in him. "I think about the night I received it," he said. "I'd been alone for a long time, and I'd started to believe that was just the facts of things. And then this letter arrived from a woman in Kansas I'd never met, and it was the most honest letter I had ever read. You just said exactly what was true and what you were hoping for and why, and there was nothing calculated about it, nothing performing. It was just you." Florence was quiet. I carried it for 2 years, he continued, because it felt like keeping a door open. Not in a sad way, in a hopeful way, like if I kept it close, the possibility it represented was still alive somewhere. And then I came, she said. Then you came, he agreed, and his voice was exactly the way it had been on the day she arrived, when he had come through the corral gate and shaken her hand and looked at her with that complete unguarded directness, and she felt that same key turning in a lock sensation that had never fully gone away, just deepened with time into something structural. I'm glad I wrote it, she said. I'm glad you walked over that mountain, he said. She laughed because he said it so matter-of-factly with such complete sincerity. I'm glad I traded Duchess. I bought you a good horse. Rosie is a wonderful horse, she agreed. I love Duchess, he said. She was 12 when she crossed the pass, and she deserved a slow retirement. Orville Peckett treats his animals well. I know, Florence said, because she did know. She had found out the following spring when she and Levi had ridden over the pass on proper horses on a clear day in May, just to see it together. And she had seen Duchess in Peckett's field looking fat and unbothered and entirely at peace with having been traded, which Florence had found both a relief and mildly insulting. But it was a funny story, and they told it that way, and Duchess's fat, peaceful retirement had become part of the family mythology. The years continue to be kind in the way that years are kind when they are built on solid foundations. Thomas, at 16, was working the ranch with a competence that made both his parents quietly proud, and he had also developed an interest in the law that Callum Briggs had been carefully nurturing, lending him books and answering his questions with the patience of a former postmaster turned deputy who had always believed that knowledge belonged to whoever would use it. Levi watched this with the same equanimity he brought to most things, which was the equanimity of a man who believed his children's lives were their own to fill. In 1896, a significant thing happened. A family arrived in the territory, the Donatos, from New Mexico, who brought with them a particular piece of news that affected Florence more than she had expected. They had come through Abilene on their way north, and they mentioned the name Garrett, the boarding house owner who had made Florence's years there so difficult, and Florence asked after him with the careful neutral tone she kept for subjects she had processed into stillness. Garrett's gone, the Donato woman said. Sold the boarding house years ago, moved on, nobody knows where. The place is a respectable operation now. New family runs it. Florence said nothing further about it, and later that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Levi, she told him the full story of her years at Garrett's boarding house in a way she had never quite told it. Not just the outline she had given him in those first 2 weeks, but the actual texture of it, the particular kind of sustained low-level dread of working for a man who wielded power over women carelessly and often cruelly, without ever doing anything specific enough to formally name. Levi listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. I'm glad you left, he said. I had nowhere to go, she said. I needed the job. I stayed longer than I should have. Most people stay longer than they should in situations like that, he said. That's how those situations work. The people in them are rarely weak. They're just managing with what they have. She looked at him. You're not going to say anything about the injustice of it. The fact that women in that situation had no recourse, no legal standing to protect themselves from employers who misused their position. I know all of that, he said evenly. It's true, and it was wrong, and it should have been different. But I don't know how to change 1876 from here. He paused. What I can do is make sure that no one in our house, is ever in that situation, and I think we've managed that. Florence looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said, we have. She reached across the table and took both his hands in hers, something she did rarely enough that when she did it, it carried full weight. You're a good man, Levi Rhodes, she said. You've always been a good man. Thomas said so before he died. Thomas said a great many things, Levi said, and his voice had the warmth it always had when Thomas Rhodes, the cousin, the original Thomas, the one whose casual conversation had started all of this, came up. He was right about some of them. He was right about you, Florence said. Levi turned his hands over and held hers, and they sat that way in the kitchen of the ranch house they had built together, figuratively speaking, that he had built literally and she had made a home of, with their children sleeping down the hall and the Colorado night enormous outside, and there was nothing left unfinished between them, nothing unsaid that needed saying, nothing holding them at a distance from each other or from themselves. In the late summer of 1897, Florence turned 47, and Levi turned 52, and they marked the occasion in the way they had come to mark most occasions, with food and the people they loved, and the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing the value of what you have. The Garcias came, Miguel and Rosa and their grown children, the youngest of whom, Rosalinda, was Thomas's age, and had recently given them all cause to wonder with the frequency and specificity of the glances exchanged across the supper table. Edna Calloway came, older now and slower, but entirely Edna, with the same comprehensive gaze and the covered basket and the opinions. Callum Briggs came with his wife, a schoolteacher named Alice whom he had married in 1889 and who had added to the community considerably. Abel Torres came with his family, because Abel had built a place on a neighboring section and was now part of the permanent landscape in a way that felt entirely right. There was a long table set up in the yard because the weather was perfect for it, that late Colorado summer quality of warm days and cool evenings that feels like the world is being its absolute best self. And the food was extravagant by ranch standards, Rosa having contributed 3 dishes, and Edna having contributed 2 pies, and Florence having roasted a beef and made bread and a cake, and Levi having contributed a keg of decent beer that had come up from a brewery in Denver on the supply wagon. Thomas sat beside Rosalinda Garcia, and they talked in the absorbed way of people who are mostly talking to each other regardless of the wider conversation around them, and Florence watched this with a private satisfaction that she did not dramatize, just allowed to be what it appeared to be. Levi, beside her, nudged her arm gently. "You're watching them," he said quietly. "I'm watching everyone," she said. "You're mostly watching them," he said, and the almost smile that had become his full smile years ago was back in its most benign and affectionate form. Clara, now 15, was sitting at the far end of the table deep in a book. She had been deep in books since she was 7, and this had never substantially changed, occasionally surfacing to eat or contribute a pointed observation to whatever conversation was happening nearby. She had recently received a letter from a correspondence school in Denver that offered a preliminary academic course for young women with aspirations toward medicine, and she had read it aloud at the breakfast table with a composure that barely contained the excitement underneath, and Florence and Levi had looked at each other and said, essentially simultaneously, yes. The cost was real but manageable. This was a point the accounts made clearly, and Florence was grateful for years of careful management that had made yes possible rather than aspirational. After supper, when the children were engaged with each other, and the adults were sitting with their cups in the warm evening, Edna leaned over to Florence and said, in the low, confiding tone she reserved for statements of particular weight, "I thought about you for years, you know. After that morning you walked in off the pass. I thought either that's going to end very well or very badly, and I hoped for the best and was glad to be right." "I'm glad you fed me," Florence said. "The beans helped considerably." "Everything begins with beans," Edna said with great conviction. "I have always believed this." Florence laughed, and the sound of it rose up into the warm evening air and dissipated into the Colorado sky, and she looked down the table at Levi, who had heard the laugh and looked up and caught her eye across the length of the table in the particular way of 2 people who have spent many years finding each other across rooms and tables and distances, easy and immediate and without effort, the way water finds its own level. He raised his cup slightly, a small gesture, and she raised hers, and it was a toast to nothing in particular and everything in general, to the woman who had written a letter and the man who had held it, to the horse traded at the base of a mountain pass, to the years between, to the letter folded in his breast pocket for 2 years, and the letter she had written again when she found hope to be, after all, the most stubborn thing in a human being, to the letter that had eventually found the man it was meant for, and to the man who had been waiting on the other side of everything for the woman who would cross it to reach him. She thought about something Rosa Garcia had said to her once, years ago, in the garden, that she and Levi had the same way of being in a room, very still but very present. She thought about how all the things that mattered most in her life had grown from that, from two people who were capable of being still together in the same space, and finding it not empty but full, not lonely but the opposite of lonely, the positive form of alone, which is called together. Thomas caught her eye from down the table and gave her a look that was entirely his father's. That same contained warmth, that same quality of saying more in a look than most people say in paragraphs. And Florence felt the particular pride of a mother who has raised someone genuinely good and knows it. Clara looked up from her book long enough to steal a piece of pie from the plate of the boy sitting next to her, and replace it with a serene expression that suggested she had not done it, which was entirely Clara. And Florence felt the particular love of a mother whose child is exactly themselves and has been given the space to be. The sun went down over the Rockies in the slow, extravagant way it went down in summer, painting the sky in layers of color that no painter had ever fully gotten right because the originals were better than any reproduction. And the lamps were brought out and lit on the table, and the conversation continued in the softer register of evening, and it was all exactly as it should be, everything resolved and present and complete. Later, much later, when everyone had gone home and the children were in bed and the yard was cleaned up and the table brought back inside, Florence and Levi sat on the porch in their chairs in the dark, as they had sat on this porch on hundreds of evenings, and the stars above them were the same stars she had watched through the window of the spare room on her first night here, 19 years ago. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. The silence came in around them like something warm, and she looked at the stars and he looked at the stars, and their hands found each other in the dark without looking, as they had always done, as they always would, the particular competent tenderness of two people who know each other's hands as well as they know anything in the world. "I'm going to write it down," Florence said. "The whole story, someday, for Thomas and Clara." "What story?" he said, though she knew he knew. "The letter," she said, "trading Duchess. Walking over the pass, finding your letter waiting at the post office, coming out here and finding you at the corral fence. It's a good story," he said. "It's the best one I know," she said. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark, and she could feel the weight of his regard the way she had always been able to feel it, that complete and direct attention that had never diminished in all the years they had known each other, and she turned her head and looked at him. "I love you, Florence Hawkins," he said, using her maiden name the way he sometimes did, as a specific acknowledgement of who she had been before she was Rhodes, because he had always understood that what she had been before mattered as much as what she had become, and that the woman who had written the letter and traded the horse and walked over the mountain was the same woman who had built this life with him, and deserved to be called by all her names. "I love you, Levi Rhodes," she said, "and I have loved you since before I met you, which I know sounds impractical, but I think we've established that I tend to be right about these things." He made that sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more private, and pulled her hand up and pressed it briefly to his mouth, and the Colorado night went on around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the stars were in their places, and the ranch was quiet, and the children were sleeping, and the letter, that first letter, the one she had written on a desperate night in 1876 with nothing left but hope, was in a tin box on the shelf inside the house now. Alongside the letter he had written back, both of them preserved the way you preserve things that have done something real in the world and deserve to be remembered for it. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be built had been built. Everything that needed to be crossed had been crossed, one mountain pass at a time, one letter at a time, one word at a time, by two people who had found in each other the thing that makes the crossing worth doing, not the destination alone, but the person waiting on the other side, holding the proof of your existence carefully, carrying it close, keeping the door open. The door had opened. They had walked through it, both of them together, and it had been everything the letter promised and more.